Hello everyone, welcome back to today's story. In this video, we follow Diep, a young woman whose peaceful life is shaken when she encounters Nai's grandmother. What begins as a tense meeting soon turns into a dangerous ultimatum. Return Nai within 2 days, or face court and even prison. As threats escalate, Diep is forced to confront her deepest fear: losing the child she has loved and raised as her own. Stay tuned until the very end to see how Diep faces this storm. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The street buzzed with life, cars honking and motorbikes weaving in and out, while the sky opened up with a drizzle that quickly thickened into steady rain. Diep tugged her jacket tighter, still feeling the warmth of Ni's small hand lingering on her palm after dropping the child off at school. She was just about to turn back toward home when an unfamiliar figure blocked her path. An older woman with sharp, hawk-like eyes stood squarely in front of her. The woman's hair was streaked with gray, her posture upright despite the years written across her face. She spoke in a tone that was calm but carried the weight of authority. "To Diep, I'm Nai's grandmother," she said, her voice slicing through the rain. Diep's heart dropped into her stomach. Her hand clenched the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She tried to keep her composure, but her trembling voice betrayed her. What do you want?" Diep asked. The woman's eyes bored into hers, unwavering. "I heard you're keeping Nai. I'm here to take her back. She belongs with me, not you." The words hit Diep like a blade, cutting straight through the fragile peace she had built with Nai. The bustle of the street faded away, the storm outside dimming to silence as Diep's world collapsed into this one impossible moment. "But Ni's been with me. She's happy with me," Diep whispered, her voice breaking, almost pleading. The woman's expression didn't soften. She stood firm, radiating the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Yet beneath her sternness was a flicker of exhaustion, as if her long journey to this confrontation had drained her. Still, her resolve did not waver. The rain pounded harder against the pavement, mirroring the chaos spiraling in Diep's chest. For the first time, she felt the looming threat of losing Nai. Not through fate, but through a claim of blood that she could not fight with love alone. Later that day, the two women found themselves seated across from one another in a small cafe. The glow of yellow lamps softened the shadows, but did nothing to ease the tension thick in the air. 2 untouched cups of lemon tea sat on the table, steam rising between them like an invisible barrier. The grandmother began to speak, her voice calm, yet commanding. "When you completed the adoption, my family, we weren't ready. We were too busy, too scattered. But now, I am here, and I've come to take Nai back where she belongs." Diep's fingers trembled as she clutched her cup, the heat burning her palms. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice out. "I tried everything to reach your family back then. I waited. I asked. No one came. Nai was alone. What was I supposed to do? Leave her waiting forever?" The grandmother's gaze was like steel. She sipped her tea before speaking again, her tone steady but laced with sharpness. "Different blood, different heart. No matter how much you care for Nai, your love cannot compare to mine. You are not family." The words pierced Diep's chest, her breath catching as if struck by a blade. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to show weakness. She lowered her head, vision blurring as memories of Nee's laughter, her little hand reaching out for comfort, and her bright smile played in her mind like a film. Outside, the rain kept falling, tapping against the glass as though echoing her despair. Around them, other patrons whispered and clinked cups, but Diep heard none of it. Her world had shrunk to this table, this woman, and the threat of losing the child she loved as her own. "Nigh is my blood," the grandmother repeated firmly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Diep raised her eyes, meeting that unyielding gaze with silent desperation. Her lips parted, but no words came. She realized in that moment this wasn't only about custody. It was about her own heart, splitting apart under the weight of something she could not fight. The lemon tea between them grew cold, its sour scent stinging Diep's nose as if mocking her pain. Every word from the grandmother chipped away at the fragile hope she held, leaving her clinging to the edge of despair. Finally, after what felt like hours of suffocating silence, the grandmother leaned back, her expression softening just enough to offer a sliver of reprieve. "Fine," she said at last. "You may keep Nigh for 1 or 2 more days, but after that, she comes back to me." Diep stared at her, stunned, her breath shallow. Relief and anguish clashed inside her like opposing storms. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice cracked with grief. She knew this mercy was only temporary. The grandmother stood, adjusting her coat. Her eyes lingered on Diep for a moment, softer now, but still unrelenting. "I'll be back," she warned, before walking out into the rain. Diep sat frozen, her cup untouched, the tea now cold and bitter. Outside, raindrops hammered against the street, each one marking the countdown of time she had left with Nigh. She hugged herself, rocking slightly in her chair, desperate to hold on to the memories that flooded her mind. Nigh's laughter as they cooked together, her small arms wrapping around her neck, the sleepy smile when she tucked her into bed. These images were treasures slipping like sand through her fingers, and no matter how tightly she clung, she couldn't stop them from slipping away. The cafe, once warm and bustling, now felt hollow, like an empty shell, filled only with Diep's silent grief. To everyone else, it was just another rainy afternoon. But to Diep, time had stopped. Each tick of the clock was a cruel reminder that her world with Nee was crumbling, piece by fragile piece. That evening, Diep tried to push the weight of the conversation aside as she and Nee sat together in a small neon-lit diner. The scent of fried food hung in the air, the chatter of customers buzzing around them. But Diep's world was only Nigh, her little face glowing with happiness, her voice rising in sweet chatter about school and friends. "Miss Diep bought me new clothes," Nigh said, her smile pure and innocent. "I'm so happy." Diep forced a smile, but her eyes drooped with exhaustion. Every word from Nee was a gem, a treasure that stabbed her heart with bittersweet joy. She tried to savor each one, knowing that soon these moments might be ripped away. "Nigh," Diep asked softly, her voice trembling, "if I wasn't with you anymore, would you be sad?" The child's wide eyes filled with alarm. She shook her head quickly. "I don't want to go with Grandma. I want to stay with you." The words twisted inside Diep like a knife, her chest tightening until she had to turn her face away. She blinked back tears, but one slipped free, glistening on her cheek. She reached for a piece of cake and placed it on Nai's plate. "Eat," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "It's delicious." The diner buzzed with laughter and clinking dishes, but for Diep, the world had gone quiet again. All she could feel was the warmth of Nai's small hand resting in hers, a fragile flame against the cold darkness pressing in. She knew this meal might be their last, and her heart shattered at the thought. Every second was a countdown, every smile a memory carved into her soul before the storm would rip it away. Outside, the neon lights flickered, casting shadows across the wet street. Inside, Diep held Nai's hand tighter, clinging to the only thing that still gave her strength. The child she loved beyond words, even as the shadow of separation loomed closer with every passing moment. The next morning dawned gray, the rain having left the streets slick and gleaming. Diep walked slowly beside Nai, the child's cheerful chatter filling the silence that weighed on her heart. Each step felt heavy, as though chains dragged behind her. She knew every moment mattered now. The grandmother's warning still echoed in her mind. 2 days. 2 days before everything she had built with Nai could be stripped away. As they reached the school gates, Nai tugged her sleeve. "Miss Diep, will you pick me up early today? We can go to the park." Diep forced a smile, though her throat ached. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll come for you." She crouched, hugging Nai tightly, breathing in the child's familiar scent, committing it to memory. Nai laughed, wriggling free, and ran through the gate, waving goodbye. Diep waved back, her hand trembling, until the little figure disappeared inside. Alone now, Diep's mask crumbled. Her shoulders slumped as tears welled up, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting anyone to see. She could not appear weak, not when the storm ahead required all her strength. That afternoon, the grandmother's words proved more than idle threats. Diep returned home to find an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a formal letter, stamped and signed, warning of legal action if Nai was not returned within 2 days. The sight of it made Diep's knees buckle. She sank onto the floor, clutching the letter as if it were a weapon aimed at her heart. Her mind raced. She thought of lawyers, of courts, of sitting in front of strangers who would decide Nai's future with cold objectivity, blind to the warmth of their bond. Could she really fight against blood ties in the eyes of the law? She whispered into the empty room, "I can't lose her. I can't." The weight of despair pressed against her chest, but beneath it, a flicker of resolve sparked. She had cared for Nai when no one else had stepped forward. She had wiped away tears, stayed awake through nights of fever, celebrated each milestone. That had to mean something. It had to count for more than just paperwork and threats. Later that night, Nai crawled into Diep's lap, yawning after a long day. They sat together on the couch, the glow of the lamp casting soft shadows around them. Diep stroked Nai's hair, struggling to keep her emotions hidden. "Miss Diep," Nai murmured sleepily, "why do you look so sad?" Diep's throat tightened. She kissed the top of the child's head, whispering, "I'm just tired, little one. Don't worry." But Nai lifted her head, eyes wide and serious beyond her years. "Is Grandma making you cry?" Diep's heart lurched. She hadn't realized Nye had noticed. "No, sweetheart," she lied softly. "She just doesn't understand. But I love you. Don't ever forget that." Nye nestled closer, whispering, "I don't want to leave you." The words were daggers, cutting deep. Diep closed her eyes, letting silent tears slide down her cheeks. She held Nye tighter, as if by sheer will she could shield her from being taken away. The following day was a blur of preparation. Diep met with a family friend, a retired lawyer who offered her advice. "You can fight this," he said, flipping through the papers the grandmother had sent. "But it won't be easy. Blood relations carry weight in court. Still, the fact that she abandoned responsibility before could work in your favor. Judges look at the child's best interest, and from what I see, you've given Nye stability." Diep's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "Do you think I have a chance?" The lawyer gave her a long look. "You have more than a chance, but you need to be ready. This woman seems determined, and determined people can be dangerous." The warning sent a chill through Diep. She thought of the grandmother's sharp eyes, her voice dripping with veiled threats. It wasn't just a legal battle. It was personal. That evening, Diep and Nye went for a walk through a quiet park. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. Nye skipped ahead, chasing after fireflies, her laughter ringing through the air. Diep watched her, heart aching with both love and fear. She tried to memorize every detail. The way Nye's hair bounced with each step, the sparkle in her eyes, the joy in her smile. These were the moments that gave life meaning, the moments she couldn't bear to lose. When Nye ran back and grabbed her hand, Diep squeezed tightly, unwilling to let go. "Promise me," Nye said suddenly, "we'll always be together." Diep's breath caught. She knelt, looking into the child's earnest eyes. "I promise I'll do everything I can," she whispered. It wasn't the full truth, but it was all she could offer. The next morning arrived with a heaviness that pressed down on Diep's chest. The grandmother appeared outside her apartment, dressed neatly, her expression cold and resolute. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Well?" she demanded. "Will you return Nye peacefully, or must I take this to court?" Diep's jaw tightened. Fear roared inside her, but she stood tall, her voice steady despite the storm raging within. "I will not give Nye up. She is happy here. She is loved here. If you want to take her, you'll have to go through the law." The grandmother's eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger flashing. "So be it. But mark my words. I will ruin you. I'll see you dragged through court, disgraced, imprisoned if I must. You'll regret ever standing in my way." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Diep trembling in the doorway. But despite the terror coursing through her veins, a strange calm settled over her. The line had been drawn. The battle was inevitable now. That night, Diep lay awake, Nye's soft breathing a comfort beside her. She stared at the ceiling, her mind a storm of fears and what-ifs. But amid the chaos, one truth shone clear. She loved Nye more than anything in the world. And love, she believed, had to count for something. She whispered into the dark, as if making a vow. No matter what happens, I will fight for you. Outside, the city buzzed with life, unaware of the storm brewing in one small apartment. Diep closed her eyes, gathering strength for the days ahead. The grandmother's threats loomed like thunderclouds, but beneath them burned a fire she refused to let die. Because for Diep, this wasn't just about winning or losing in court. It was about protecting the child who had become her family, her heart, her very reason to keep moving forward. And as the clock ticked closer to the final day of reckoning, Diep knew one thing for certain. No matter how fierce the storm, she would not surrender nigh without a fight.